Thank you for joining IAB There.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to IAB There. Thank you for joining us today. IAB There is IAB's video virtual podcast as we keep in touch with our industry, the broader ecosystem, and the world during what has been a very eventful 2 years for the globe and in our space. And I'm excited to welcome today Stephanie Hansen, the offering manager from OneTrust Preference Choice. She and I are excited for an in-depth conversation where we'll learn about opportunities in privacy and in security, transparency, and consent, and everything in between in today's digital marketplace. All of these issues are timely. They're on the front page. There's intersection with Congress, federal government, state capitals, and even in parliaments overseas. So much to discuss today. Stephanie, we cannot thank you enough for joining us. Give us a little bit about your background and about OneTrust.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to come on and have a conversation. As you mentioned, this is changing constantly, so we're really excited to be here and to join in. So OneTrust is really a technology platform in the privacy, security, and governance space, and that also includes a huge area of focus for us around transparency and consent and choice, and really how brands, publishers, organizations really across all industries are connecting with their customers to build trust and to build up that communication and privacy and choice. So we offer a bunch of tools and technology as well as research to keep up with, as you said, the changing landscape and allow organizations to really continue to operate as a business, but start focusing more on building trust with their customers and their overall privacy and security and governance strategy. So in my role, Dave, I really focus on the CMP, or that's consent management products, and really function across our R&D products. So as I said, software, delivery, all of that, but also working directly with our customers. So I really specialize in helping our publishers, ad tech customers, and advertisers address these concerns with consumers, and spend a lot of my time these days, connecting one-on-one about the changing landscape. So I'm sure we can dive in there.
And Stephanie, just a moment for those who don't know the acronym, CMPs, Consent Management Products.
Yeah. Yep.
Go, if you could, just for a moment, how does a run-of-the-mill company use CMP? Just a hypothetical to kind of paint the picture, if you could.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And especially on the terminology, that was made popular essentially by our friends at IAB Europe coming out with the Transparency and Consent Framework, or TCF as it's usually abbreviated. CMP is the acronym used in that model to identify the player that sits on the publisher's site to help capture that consent from the end user and pass that downstream to the ad tech vendors. So CMP is now being adopted more broadly to account for what everyone would normally think of as a cookie banner, right? Because one of the things that's happening is with cookie banners, with third-party cookies being deprecated, people are starting to ask, well, what's the future of the cookie banner? And should we be talking about cookies, or is there also local storage and other mechanisms and technology that functions to actually process data? So that's why we sort of broadened the term to CMP. And essentially a CMP functions, just like I said, to be that, sometimes we call it the front yard of a site, right? To say it's the first thing that individuals see when they interact with your technology and with your brand, to get a disclosure or an understanding of what's happening with their data, sort of an introduction into your tech. And in most cases, a lot of choice and options also get overlaid there. So that's where there's a ton of opportunity for expanding within the CMP landscape to collect more, first-party data directly from our visitors, potentially identify those individuals. So that's where we start to see really the evolvement from just a cookie banner to much more here on the consent management platform side of things.
No, it makes perfect sense. And that first-party relationship, with myself being here, based in Washington, D.C., running IAB's D.C. office and our interface with governments at all levels, that first-party data and that first-party relationship is a very big deal right now. And how CMP is managed, just as a bit of a footnote, consumers are communicating to members of Congress that when they begin a relationship with pick your website, the Washington Post, the New York Times, et cetera, and they authenticate into that website, they don't know where else their data is going past the New York Times, past San Francisco Chronicle, pick your source. And it sounds to me like you're deeply involved in all of that, as is OneTrust. So again, the intersection of policy, government, data, consumer transparency, et cetera. I would imagine there are a number of challenges, though, right now, apart from that, just in terms of privacy, security, and transparency. Have you seen tectonic shifts in the last couple of years? Is it causing OneTrust to iterate at a more rapid pace? And how does consumer behavior play into that privacy / digital advertising construct? Again, something we're hearing a lot about here in Washington, but my sense is it's causing OneTrust to iterate and for you to really be on your toes.
Absolutely. Yes. 100%. I'd say, the biggest kind of macro shift that we've seen in general is that organizations are really starting to pay attention at the C-suite level to their strategy in privacy. Right? It's no longer just about security, and it's no longer just, the CISO's job or maybe the chief privacy officer's job. These issues are really bubbling up and becoming a true strategic differentiator for organizations to say, hey, we need to have a long-term plan here. It's not just about, assessing risk, though that is a huge part of how you actually go about operationally, acting on these things, but it's really about setting that strategy in that direction and permeating that message across the entire organization through to marketing teams and the individuals that actually communicate directly with customers, right? What's the messaging that goes on your different interactions? To your point, when you go to this site, how are you communicating? That's so important. It's now getting the attention and getting the focus of top level executives within organizations, because just as you mentioned, consumers are clamoring saying, hey, we don't know what's going on, and we don't feel that we have a clear picture of what's happening with our data. And of course, GDPR was the ultimate catalyst for all of this. But at that time, we saw lawyers really paying attention, right? It was the lawyers that were saying, hey, by the way, this is something we need to think about. And really, it's taken a few years for that to reach the full organization and all the way up to the executive level. So I'd say that's the biggest thing we're seeing is more and more folks paying attention, embracing the long-term strategic move, and seeing how all these pieces really come together for their full organization. So it's not just the CMP, but it's also the overall risk strategy and the operations and the incident planning and putting all of that together, and even thinking about ethics and environmental social governance and things like that coming together. So that's the big picture. But when we look at the advertising landscape, everything is under a microscope right now, right? We see everything with big tech. There's practically nothing else in the headlines right now, right? So it's been really interesting because I think this world that a lot of us live in and focus in has become exposed to our friends, our families, our colleagues, right? And people are starting to ask questions. I know I get calls from my family members saying, what's the deal with cookies going away? Like, can you tell me more about that, right? So it's starting a really interesting conversation on the consumer side where people are really starting to try to understand what's going on. Now, admittedly, Dave, when I talk to them, 3 minutes in, they're like, okay, that's enough, right? So people reach a limit of what they really want to understand, but they are expressing that concern. And I think the additional complexity here is the continued evolution of the device landscape, right? And so I'm a technology person. I'm total, self-declared nerd. So I like to look at all the devices that are entering the mix, right? Thinking about, a mobile device is just my device, but my computer now that's shared with kids for e-learning at home. And then I have my TV that's shared across my household. And how does the data look across all those devices? And how do you look at identities of, a family versus an individual, and how that really gets captured and passed through from an advertising perspective? I think all of this complexity is really interesting and creates a lot of opportunity that when you pair it with that consumer demand of more transparency, we have so much exciting stuff around the corner to think about, really how this gets communicated.
You touched on GDPR in Europe. You mentioned the transparency and consent framework that IAB put together with the IAB Tech Lab. There really is a shifting global landscape around consent, transparency, and consumer expectations. And we saw it here with the California Consumer Protection Act, CCPA, that came out of Sacramento a few years ago that really changed the landscape here in the US. Interesting component to that, again, the crossing lines in my world and yours, we don't have a national privacy law. We have privacy laws coming from one state, California, now another state, Virginia also, and from a foreign country, whereas Congress is sitting back and not stepping in to give those predictable rules of the road, to give certainty to innovators and expectations to consumers. Will we ever get a national preemptive federal privacy standard? Unclear. It's what I work on every day, but we shall see. So you and I will be collaborating more and more as the months and years go by, hopefully, to make sure that all companies are knowing how to comply with this, taking their cues from your leadership at OneTrust and even beyond. And Stephanie, we just came out of IAB's annual leadership meeting, or ALM, the biggest event of the year for IAB. Normally it's in Palm Springs. Thousands of people are there. We did it online this year. Some definite conveniences there, but we lost out on that tremendous in-person aspect that we've had for years at ALM. There were a lot of themes that came out of it, a lot of CTV discussions, et cetera. Anything that you want to highlight, anything that stuck out in your space or concerning OneTrust that was particularly noteworthy?
Yeah. And ALM, I think, was an amazing production. So first off, I would say kudos to the entire team at IAB that was behind the, pulling all of that together, because it was truly a very comprehensive event and covered a ton of topics with amazing speakers. I was just amazed by the caliber of speakers that, to your point, Dave, having a virtual event allows you to pull in, right, all of these interesting folks and bring them together. And I agreed, there were lots of themes that came up, throughout the whole event around addressability and, streaming, as you mentioned, measurement. I know media transparency and the whole policy day. But of course, privacy is where I live, and I tend to find privacy coming up in everything. But I truly did see, bits of privacy coming out of every session that I tuned into at ALM. There was some component of how do we connect with customers, or how does privacy enter the mix here, and how do we use that as a strategic advantage? So I certainly saw that coming through. And I thought it was fascinating to see the engagement on the technology platform that was used to host the event, right? Going virtual opened up opportunity for, folks to really chime in meaningfully live while the event was going on. Whereas if you're in an auditorium, right, you're having these thoughts in your head, you can't, turn to the person a few rows over and whisper an insightful thought. But I thought that was really fun about, having the virtual events this year, which has opened up the opportunity for meaningful conversation to take place in the chat and really drive more connection. So completely agree. We lose out on those, the in-person networking and all of those conversations. But I think that was a great substitute. And there was some meaningful conversation about, things like GPC, the browser control that's been proposed and is in draft, and to see that sort of engagement in the panel on CCPA specifically, I think was a great value add when you look at the sessions. So I think the sessions are still on demand though, Dave, right? So folks can go back and—
Very much. Anybody can see them at any time, IAB.com. They're all there, CEOs, senators, industry leaders. Hopefully everyone can dive in at their leisure. But you mentioned GPC, global privacy controls, an interesting policy pop-up, because this began, the idea for this, in a tweet from the California Attorney General, who just departed that role, Javier Becerra. He tweeted this out. It really caught the eye of the entire industry, privacy advocates around the globe, lobbyists, advocates, technologists, et cetera. And it puts forth the idea of a browser signal. Unclear whether Congress is going to grab hold of this and say this is a great idea. This will give consumers the control that they want and deserve, et cetera. Can you talk a minute about what it could mean, what the likelihood of it working in terms of a CMP, consumer awareness, choice, et cetera, construct would be? If you could, Stephanie, just a little color on the possibility of a global privacy control.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting topic for a number of reasons. Of course, we've got the regulatory landscape, which you've already acknowledged is fragmented and confusing. So let's just say in the context of GPC, which is designed to be a browser signal modeled essentially after do not track. So it's essentially the new do not track. It's a single binary value, right? Like an opt-out single value. And the design of it is that it's set either at the browser level itself or with a plugin to your browser. So essentially, at the browser level by the individual consumer. And then that signal can be communicated. Any site that you hit, that site is able to read and see that signal because it's coming from the browser level. So that's sort of the technology and the design around it. But the questions, and there are many, come up when you start to look at, well, what does that mean if you're not a California resident, right? What does it mean if I, as a resident of Atlanta, Georgia, go around and signal this? Should folks respect that? It's very unclear right now what needs to happen with that. And with do not track, ultimately what happened, is that it became something that folks didn't listen for, and it became something that they needed to disclose in their privacy policy what they did. But essentially, everyone just said, we don't do anything with it, right? And so I think a big kind of open question here is also, you've got someone who sets the signal. And then you've got someone, an individual who sets a signal. They're either setting the signal to opt out or not opt out. But you've also got the other side of the coin, which is someone who doesn't make a choice. And I think that's the really big open question, right? Is if you have a privacy first browser or a privacy first plugin that someone is using, they may not understand that they're making that opt-out choice by installing and using that browser. So I think, again, to bring it back to the consumer, it's about educating people to the level that they can handle and that they have an appetite for, but allowing them to see that choice. And I think that's the real question here, is how do people make the choice of whether they're signaling this or not? And there's a lot that remains to be seen there as we look at additional browsers and plugins that may adopt the signal. Right now, the signal is being used in browsers that are very, I think, clear and transparent about using that. But if it comes to browsers like Safari and Chrome, where you've got 19%, 60+% of usage, that's where it starts to get really interesting for consumers. So the other complexity here, Dave, is the granularity of the signal. So right now the drafts are, it's still in draft, the spec, the technical specifications, but it's really just this one signal. So we don't have an audit trail, a history. We don't have the ability to support additional granularity. So when we talk about TCF, and that framework has a lot of different purposes in it for, different ways that data could be processed. With the global privacy control signals that stands right now, it's just that one signal. So I would say today as it stands, it doesn't have the granularity to apply globally. And while we're all sort of grounded right now, of course, we're not flying around, right? We are used to a world where we fly around and we end up in different places. So what does it mean to have a single opt-out for an individual that crosses borders, that crosses jurisdictions, or for processing data, and working with vendors that cross borders? So those are just some of the big open questions. And I think there's a lot more interesting conversation to come.
I completely agreed. And you mentioned the cross-border reality that hopefully the world returns to very quickly, but with a patchwork of multiple state privacy bills, things could get a little confusing. You could get on a plane at LaGuardia with a comfort and an understanding of certain privacy controls in New York, and then get off at LAX and encounter an entire new reality of opt-ins, consent pop-ups, et cetera. And that is a fragmented landscape that is bad for everyone. And we are, again, pushing Congress to take a very close look at this, but I would bet it's giving you headaches and anxiety around what a fragmented landscape could look like. So I think you touched on that. One just quick follow on, Stephanie, is it something that you and your colleagues at OneTrust are preparing for in terms of if there are multiple state bills with multiple state compliance measures? Michael Hahn, IAB's general counsel, is counseling all of our companies around that kind of gathering storm of got to make sure that you're complying with different state privacy laws, because if not, you could be in violation, you could be fined, Lord knows where else this could go, private rights of action, et cetera. Is it something that for which you are preparing in terms of a fragmented landscape?
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. I mean, that is the reality, like you said, of the world that we live in right now at this moment. Could change at any time, but that's kind of what we're seeing right now, right? And so as we think about moving forward, certainly we are also, expecting that in time, eventually there will likely be a federal law that we can look to. But in the interim, how to navigate that becomes complex. And you also have to deal with the fact that you may want to extend privacy rights to all of your customers because you feel that that's the right thing to do as a business. But then you have to deal with the true operational challenges. So for example, when we looked at helping folks prepare for California, we saw a lot of folks say, I want to extend these rights to everyone. But in terms of things like giving people a copy of their data or deleting them, that's where I have certain timeline constraints that apply to me for California residents that don't necessarily apply elsewhere. So I might have to look at a tiered approach where I'm prioritizing those that I need to based on the laws that are in place today, but then still look at an approach that allows me to address others as I can get to them. But as you said, that's going to get more and more complex as we have these state by state regulations. So that's where we look for similarities, differences. You mentioned Michael Hahn's office and the work they're doing. I've actually been working very closely with him over the last year, since last July, to map out in our cross-jurisdictional privacy project across different jurisdictions globally where the similarities are and differences are across privacy laws, so that we can think about specifically how those laws impact digital advertising and scenarios where you might have people collecting information in one country and passing that off to vendors in another. So it's not just state by state, but it's truly a global problem, even once we get the federal law, right? And so that's where I think a lot of organizations just need to look at it from a risk-based approach, but also a strategy on how they want to communicate with consumers. And that's where we see more and more of these sort of trust centers and a lot more communication coming about to consumers about, hey, here is what's happening really, and exposing some of that in a transparent manner so that there's a way to dig in. I wouldn't say that there's one single easy answer. The other interesting concept here, Dave, to think about, and that's been coming up quite a bit in the community, is the identity landscape, right? And we could go down a whole rabbit hole there. But once you have an identified individual, you have more to go on in terms of where are they a resident of, where are they physically located, and who they truly are, as opposed to presuming that. So, right now we have technology that delivers a different, say, CMP experience. We can go to the state by state level. And in California, that works really well because California is a big state. But you get up into New England and you think about someone going, who lives in Massachusetts, Boston, and works in Rhode Island, or vice versa, and they're crossing those state borders, and that gets really, really messy. So I wouldn't say we have all the answers, but certainly to your point, we're actively working with our customers in terms of how to address these challenges and looking forward to hopefully a federal law in the near future. And a fun fact, I just lost a bet today, Dave, with a friend and customer. I had a 24-month bet that we'd have a federal law that I lost now. So funny that we still don't have one, but we will continue to work towards that.
Well, on behalf of IAB's lobbying operation and all of our advocates across industry, I feel like maybe we should help pitch in for you to pay off that bet, because that is what we need. We're all moving hard in that direction to bring these issues to the surface in front of the House and the Senate and the relevant committees of jurisdiction, and to just flash that red light even more around Congress tuning into these issues. They're so complex. Privacy is becoming so distorted and mutated in terms of Section 230 platform liability, insightful speech, the use of individual content, personal information, throw in antitrust, all these other issues, and it turns into this very, very toxic brew that we are trying to help unpack for state and federal legislatures. But you've really shined very, very big lights on this, Stephanie, and all the tasks that are in front of us, you, your colleagues at OneTrust, everything that you're doing in the consumer transparency and privacy space. Thank you for this amazing conversation. I want to thank OneTrust again for sponsoring this episode. And again, IAB There is a production of the Interactive Advertising Bureau. Our show today was produced by Connor Healy and John Ward. I'm Dave Grimaldi here in Washington, D.C. On behalf of myself and my colleagues at IAB, thanks for watching. See you next time.